Well, welcome. I want to thank everybody for sticking around this afternoon. It's kind of hard to be the last group for the day, but we'll try to make it somewhat interesting for you. So how many of you have had some sense of carrying capacity in the past? All right, so good. We'll stage that. Before I get ahead of myself, I would like to introduce myself. I'm Randy Welsh. I'm the National Program Lead for Wild and Scenic Rivers for the Forest Service, and I also serve as the chair for the Interagency Wild and Scenic River Coordinating Council, which is made up of the four land management agencies that manage wild and scenic rivers for the federal government. And with me today is Adam Milner, who is from the Salem office of the BLM. Now, originally your program said Molly Chaudet from the Forest Service was going to present this, and Molly retired on me at the beginning of the year. So Kathy Bailey, who is the national lead for the Wild and Scenic River program for the BLM, was going to pitch hit and be here, but she got sequestered, so she couldn't make the trip. So Adam graciously agreed to step in for Kathy, and Adam is our newest member of the Interagency Wild and Scenic River Coordinating Council as a field representative for the BLM. So everybody, thank Adam right now for participating today.
Yeah, my name's Adam Milner. I'm an outdoor recreation planner with the BLM. I live in Portland, work for the Salem district. Also want to highlight that Heath Emmons, out of the Glen Allen field office up in Alaska, helped contribute to this. So I'm just kind of stepping in for him and Kathy and all the other folks that couldn't be here. So.
All right, thanks, Adam. So if you think about carrying capacity, I think most people think about it in terms of sort of physical capacity. There's a sign over on the wall that says 1,226 people can fill this room. Somehow I think it means with the wall down, the whole ballroom could probably hold 1,200 people. So think about it as this room holding 600 people. But that's a fire department physical capacity for a movement, getting access out, whatever. If you were going to hold a cocktail party in here, maybe you would be comfortable with having 500 people. If you were going to have a theater set up and watch a movie, just did a quick calculation of these seats, you could probably put 400 seats in here pretty comfortable before people started to fidget, or you wouldn't be able to put more than 400 seats in. But if you really wanted to have like a small group discussion or a meeting of some sort, you might be down to 20 or 30 seats or people in a room. And really, if you thought about it, you could probably put 5,000 bodies in this room if you filled it fully to capacity. But why would you want to do that? So really the point is capacity really varies depending on what you want to do. And we really don't want to talk about carrying capacity per se. It's an old definition for a concept. What we want to talk about is user capacity. So what our intent for this next 30 minutes is to talk about a paper that the Interagency Wild and Scenic Rivers Coordinating Council has been preparing that will identify how to define carrying user capacities for wild and scenic rivers. Why you would want to do that, the basis for it in law, and then how to go about doing it. So this presentation really is to establish that legal requirement and then describe how we used user capacity in the context of wild and scenic river management in our Wild and Scenic River Management Comprehensive Resource Management Plans. And then we want to share with you a 10-step process that's been developed that will walk people through the process of identifying user capacities for wild and scenic rivers. And it's not a recipe, and it's not a how-to. We want to just explain what those 10 steps are as we go through this discussion. And then finally show the relationship of carrying user capacities to NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, environmental analysis that each of us as federal land management agencies are obligated to perform, and then explain the context of our Wild and Scenic River Coordinating Council paper that is the basis for this talk and what our next steps are for getting more feedback about it. So in the context that we're going to talk about today, visitor use management is a pretty big field. And the federal agencies have identified and established a visitor use management council that's to help the agencies figure out how to handle common visitor use management issues. Well, one of the issues that they've identified early on is how do the agencies address visitor use capacities in a general sense. And in our case, we're looking at a smaller subset of that as how to address wild and scenic river user capacities, which are a somewhat different beast than a regular visitor use capacity. So a few definitions. Visitor capacity, as defined by the Visitor Use Management Council, says that it's the maximum amount and the type of visitor use that an area can accommodate while sustaining desired resource conditions and visitor experiences consistent with the values for which the area was established. Now, early on, the Interagency Wild and Scenic River Coordinating Council, back in the early 80s, codified a definition of carrying capacity, which says it was the quantity of recreation use an area can sustain without adverse impact on the outstanding remarkable values and the free-flowing character of the area. Now, that was back in 1982, and again, it was thinking more about the carrying capacity concept of a physical limit of some sort. We now have turned around and are following with the Visitor Use Management Council and using a more updated term for user capacity that in the context of wild and scenic rivers is that the actual level of visitor use that will not adversely impact river values or other desired conditions. And in this case, river values in a specific wild and scenic river context refer to free flow, water quality, and the ORVs, which are the threefold purposes for wild and scenic rivers. So what we have done is we've created a paper. How many of you ever been to the rivers.gov website? So a few, but not very many of you. So on the rivers.gov website, there is a comprehensive list of technical papers that have been produced by the Interagency Coordinating Council that cover a variety of topics that deal with the management of wild and scenic rivers. The whole gamut from management, designation, study, boundaries, implementing comprehensive resource management plans, you name it, it's probably there already. But this was one paper that we didn't have, and that was how to address user capacity. So it is being worked on right now. In addition, there was a new paper that we produced in 2010 that talked about, for newly designated wild and scenic rivers, what are the interim managements and the steps to develop a comprehensive river management plan. This current paper is meant to complement that paper to help people understand how to apply user capacities when they're developing their comprehensive resource management plans. So why do we worry about user capacities? Well, in a wild and scenic river context, the Wild and Scenic River Act in section 3D1 makes it very clear that the plan shall address resource protection, development of lands and facilities, user capacities, and other management practices necessary or desirable to achieve the purposes of the Act. So for us, it's a requirement by Congress that we include user capacity in our CRMPs. And this was made even clearer in a recent court ruling back in 2008 by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, where the Park Service lost a lawsuit on their Merced Comprehensive Resource Management Plan. And as part of that ruling, the judge made it very clear that the Park Service should deal with and discuss the maximum number of people that can be received within the Wild and Scenic River Corridor, and that he went on to say that CRMPs need to include specific measurable limits on use by use types, by activity types, and that these use levels have to be set so that they do not adversely affect the river values. Again, those threefold values of free flow, water quality, and ORVs. Several other things that came out of that lawsuit is that those limits need to be specific, measurable limits based on the use, that the CRMP needs to discuss that maximum number of people in the corridor, which really means if you've got activity A, activity B, activity C, activity D, all the way up to activity Z, you've got to figure out what the use limits associated with each of those activities would be to sum up to some maximum limit. And it's not a linear equation. It's more of an algebraic programming function to figure out that polygon of activities and uses that will stay within the level that will protect your river values for each of those different activities. So the amounts of use need to be linked to the current uses in the river, to the facilities and how those facilities affect ORVs and those uses. That use levels may not necessarily rely on current uses, but you have to think about future uses or changes to use over time. And that your CRMP needs to include proactive measures, responses that you plan to take to keep you within the level or the limit that you establish, as well as the monitoring necessary to ensure that you are meeting your obligation to protect those values. So that CRMPs in this context would use this capacity framework to protect and enhance river values, and that you're going to use whatever capacities you come up with and the decisions for how you come up with those capacities to protect those values. That one of the key components of a wild and scenic river is its classification. Wild, scenic, or recreational based on the development level that the area had at the time of designation. That classification level also sort of creates a limit. It creates somewhat of a physical capacity, a social capacity, as to the types of activities that can be considered. Because one of the key tenets is that we do not change the classification of a wild and scenic river over time. So that would limit the types of activities that could occur. Wild river segments wouldn't have activities that would change or modify the landscape to any great material effect. Scenic sections, you wouldn't have activities that would, recreation activities that would propose changes to the shorelines or add additional access points to make it easier for people to perform some sort of recreation activity. So you have to think within the context of the classification as you look at your user capacities. So it's also important that you look at the scale, because the scale of the proposed activities, how much of the area they use, whether they're limited in context or very narrow in focus, and that CRMPs need to have some amount of flexibility associated with them so that you can adjust and you can take action over time. And they need to include the criteria that you're using and then the actual numbers. And I think that a lot of us struggle with that use of actual numbers. We don't like to think about putting an actual number out there because that then forces us to act upon it when we get to the point of exceeding that number or get close to exceeding that number. But that's what the judge told us we needed to do, is to set actual numbers. All right, so we talked about this 10-step process, and I'm going to turn it over to Adam, who's going to walk us through the 10 steps of a wild and scenic river user capacity analysis.
All right, like Randy said, this is kind of a big deal for the land management agencies, especially if you work on a wild and scenic river. And I think you hit on it there at the end, is that, you know, we don't like to use numbers. We're river people. We don't want to count past 5, sometimes not past 3. So it's a situation where for a long time, as the land management agencies on these WSRs have been relying on narratives and descriptions of values and other things. And the ruling on the Merced really brought to our attention that when you put that in front of the court, they say, okay, that's great. We appreciate that you want to protect and enhance river values. We appreciate that you have a sense of that there's trade-offs here and that you're going to take the appropriate actions. You're going to take the necessary actions. Well, unfortunately, in reality, that requires a number, and that requires a number that we have to set. And so this is a process, and like Randy said, that makes a lot of people nervous, especially if, in many of these cases, if not the majority, we're already probably past a number that is really comfortable for all parties involved or for protecting river values. So you have to think of this process, and I think that a lot of folks here are not necessarily ever going to have to write one of these plans, but I think these concepts are interesting and illustrative for us to work through some of the tough things as we have to do more of this. We're going to have to make more use allocation decisions. We're going to have a little more heavy-handed management on rivers as we move forward, and we have more people out there. So I know that everyone here, might not necessarily have to do this, but I encourage you to kind of stick with me here and walk through this process, because I think the folks on the council have done a really good job of tackling something here that's pretty thorny, and it's going to be a big deal in the next few planning cycles and as new rivers are designated. So I want to highlight about the 10 steps, and we'll go through them, but this is not a one after the other type process. This is 10 steps. It's not a standalone document. This isn't like an appendix to your plan or something outside of NEPA. This is really a tool for us as river managers to work through to ensure that we have our bases covered in a logical way, in an ordered way, so that we can make sure that when we do get around to setting that difficult number, we have justification. Funny word, right? Justification for that. Everyone should be scared of arbitrary and capricious. Those are two not good words. So what we're talking about here is working us through this process and arriving at logical conclusions. So the first step, as with any planning effort, and a lot of this is stuff that prior to this whole user capacity issue even got brought up, are things that we should have been doing and things that you're going to do anytime that you engage in a plan of any type. So a lot of this will sound familiar if you have any kind of a planning background whatsoever. So first step, describe your free flow and ORVs. Like Randy said, it's the point of the Wild and Scenic River Act. It's our obligation, and that's what we're managing for, and we'll talk about that. Identify the desired conditions. We can all recognize a problem. Planning requires some forward thinking, identifying what you would like that situation to be. 3, establish management standards. This is where the numbers start. Oh boy. 4, identify kinds of use. This is the fun part. We'll get to that. 5, identify an amount of use. There it is, amount numbers again. We're really drilling down into this by this point, by area, by type. We're going to link that use, the type of use, the amount of use, and we're going to actually link it spatially to a river corridor where that's occurring and what facilities are being used. We're going to, number 7 is the big kahuna, estimate maximum numbers. That's kind of the crux of this whole thing. And then really 8 through 10 are a little bit somewhat downhill from there in terms of identifying what actions you would take if you have a problem. Hopefully we'll identify actions that we can take before we have a problem. That's a novel concept. And then, of course, the M word, monitoring. So step 1, river values. So if you're not familiar with the Wild and Scenic River Act, which not that many people are, it's a pretty complex policy framework, but describing river values, that involves your free-flowing characteristics, your water quality, and then any of those ORVs, outstandingly remarkable values. That's outstandingly remarkable. That must be pretty good, right? Those are all the things that you love about your river and make your river unique. Really, this is similar to sort of an affected environment or a kind of a state of the union right here. What are we dealing with when it comes to this situation that you have on your river right now? It really serves as the baseline from which to develop the rest of your things. This is an important step. They're all important steps. Describe conditions at the time of designation. That's really hard. Don't we wish we had information from 5 years ago? A lot of these rivers were designated in the 70s, the late 80s, the 90s. So you'll start to see that this is one of those things that might sound nice and easy, but establishing a set of existing conditions in the past, that's a challenge, as you can probably see. What you're going to want to do is include the kinds and amounts of visitor use, the facilities that are there, and how those relate to river values. So, well, if one of your values is recreation, you're going to describe, well, we got some non-motorized boating, we have some motorized boating, we have some bank fishing, we have these other uses. You're going to describe those to the best that you can in your existing situation. You're going to characterize those, and then here's that forward-thinking bit again. We want to identify likely trends for the future. As you can imagine, river use and river trends are pretty dynamic. So we're actually going to try to look out into the future a little bit through this whole process. These are typically 15, and more realistically, they're 20, 25-year, sometimes 30-year plans. You're going to want to anticipate what you're going to deal with during that time frame. And then a piece that starts on step one and carries through is the idea of measurable indicators. These, you're going to want to pick ones that are measurable and they're subject to change. So I hope that's obvious that you're not going to pick an indicator that's never going to change, although that would be really easy and probably more fun. A couple examples: number of user days that groups are required to camp within sight or sound of other campers. Camp encounters, we're probably all familiar with that in a river experience. Or amount of bare ground associated with high, medium, or low use campsites. Now, when it comes to picking indicators, if you're managing a river or you're a lot of use on a river, you're probably going to know your indicators. It's the stuff that people are talking to you about a lot. When you say, hey, I heard you had a nice trip last weekend, they go, yeah, but I saw like 4 too many people. It was just a little bit crowded. It's the stuff that's going to come up over and over again, those things that are measurable, subject to change, and are probably a problem, potentially. And we'll get to that here in the next couple steps. But picking these indicators in the first step is important because these are going to track through your entire process. So desired conditions. This is kind of the vision quest. What you're trying to define here is the minimum standard of those indicators you just picked and the protection that will ensure the protection of your river values, your free flow, your water quality, your ORV. So you see you're narrowing in on a situation where you're trying to figure out indicators, and the next step is standards to quantify how much can we take. And of course, it's based on different resource indicators, different social indicators, kind of like Randy pointed out in this room. Well, depending on what you're going for, whether it's a cocktail party or just making a lot of people uncomfortable, you're going to pick different indicators. And an important component here, if you're not familiar with the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, it requires us to protect and enhance river values. Protect being the minimum, of course, that's our obligation, and then enhance. And so what really is going to be important moving forward when it comes to WSR planning is differentiating between these are our steps that are required for protection, and then these are our steps or other actions that are required for enhancement. And I think that's an interesting concept that, you hope people pick their words carefully back in 1968 when these acts get put together. Protect and enhance. I think that's a solid foundation for us to move through this. So step 2, you're going to realize in that step 1 when you're gathering all that info, well, I kind of need it to be a little bit more site specific. We have long rivers. Those rivers are much different. So what we can do now and throughout this process is define analysis areas. So analysis areas, kind of like our keynote speaker at the beginning of the conference, this is where we do the chopping up part. Let's just hope our chopping up makes more sense. So what you're doing when you're coming up, the identify need for action piece. So that comes up. So in step 1, you've got your existing condition. Step 2, you're hopefully agreeing with folks on what the desired condition is. And when you talk about desired condition from a recreational standpoint, I think there's an interesting term that they've used in the paper that really stuck out to me as a rec guy, which is what we're trying to do is define or capture the essence of a river experience. The language and the wordsmithing in these things is pretty important. When we're writing about what ORV we're trying to protect, it's not sufficient to say, I like hanging out on rivers. It's very important to take the time to differentiate and to describe the experience that people are having out there. And I think we've come a long way from a recreation management and planning standpoint to be able to have the tools to do this a little bit better. So what kind of a setting do you want? Do you want a natural setting? Is it okay if there are power lines? Is it okay if there's a road next to it? Are you looking for are you looking to party on Lake Havasu, or are you looking to go down the Grand Canyon? So you can obviously, we know implicitly that there's a wide range, but what we need to do is define that essence and that experience that people are looking for. And when you look at, so step 1 was the existing, step 2 is conditions, you're going to have a disconnect there. And there you go, there's your need for action. And Randy's going to talk about how this applies to NEPA, but you're going to have a disconnect between those two things, and that's what we're going to work on. So step 3, so we're looking at, at this point, numbers We haven't gotten numbers too much. Standards is where we really get into starting to deal with the numbers. So you have your indicators. That's camp encounters. That's bare ground. Standards is where we're starting to set those numbers that we feel can protect river values. Again, this is where we're distinguishing between protect and enhance. How many camp encounters is protecting? How many would be enhancing that experience? Again, standards are numbers. They're measurable. And what you need to do during this step is consider all the components of your system, the biological, physical, and social aspects of it. Standards could either be a resource condition that must be met or cannot be exceeded, a percentage, for instance. There's a number of different ways to look at standards. So now we're on to step 4, and this is important to say. It's not just river use in general. We're talking about different types of uses. You need to drill down from a recreational standpoint on the kinds and types of use that could protect or enhance river values. This is a little bit where the rubber starts to meet the road in terms of, people maybe disagreeing a little bit about what sort of river experience it is that they're looking for. Is this something where a jet boat is appropriate? Well, it kind of depends on the values that you described at the beginning and the existing conditions and your desired conditions. So you're looking at those uses, and you're looking at those that meet the standards that you just set. Not the place to have a long laundry list of things that are okay and not okay. We don't need to get into detail about the color of your boat. So we need to look at trying to put those categories of what meets or does not meet kind of our intent for protection and enhancement. We're going to take that use, and we're going to identify the actual amount of that use. So by the types we just laid out, we've got some non-motorized kayaking, we've got some motorized, we've got some drift boating over here. And what we're going to do is we're going to assign amounts of use. This is really kind of foreshadowing the maximum capacity that we're going to get to here soon. And you can do it, like we said, by analysis areas, by the chopping up method. You can use segments. You can use different sites, portions thereof. Obviously, lots of different ways to cut this up. I want to encourage you to look at how people are actually accessing it. So here's a little, just an example of how these things play out on the ground. You have multiple segments. You have multiple classifications, wild, recreational, which kind of correlates to the level of development that's on those river segments. And so what you want to do is in each of these segments, you're trying to quantify the amount of use by those types. And again, you're always tying it back to that overall objective of protecting the river values and then tracking through on your indicators and standards. So you really want to make sure when you get to this step, we're talking about X number of boats. So we're linking that use to locations and facilities. These things occur in reality. They occur in a spatial context. The more you can do to say this put in, that access point, it's going to go a long way. You may have already done this in your earlier steps, but this is kind of pointing out you need to take this step of making sure that you're tying these things to locations on the ground. Sure. And Randy's clarifying these could be upland activities as well. So a wild scenic river corridor, typically, a setback on either side. There could be upland activities as well. And I'm kind of focusing on the river aspect because it's sort of easier to work through. So step 7, maximums. This is what the court asked the Park Service to do. It's not just throwing out numbers. It's throwing out what is the maximum number. What is the turning point where you are starting to violate those standards that you set? What's the turning point when your conditions are starting to go downhill? What is that maximum number? And this is, like I said, this is the crux. This is what we haven't wanted to do for a long time because it's hard. And we're going to have to do our best. An obvious point here, hopefully you're involving the public in a collaborative discussion, and I hope you're doing it before this step. Because if you come out to the public at the moment that you have a maximum number, you might not have a great meeting. Just a heads up. These are sensitive and often volatile issues. Thresholds. It's kind of similar to the limits of acceptable change. We're taking those standards and indicators. If your standard is a certain number of user campsites per mile or a certain number of camp encounters, what's a point before that threshold that you can actually reasonably take management action? So it might be before your standard is set or your standard is met or exceeded. It's a threshold, and there's hopefully going to be a buffer. Not in all cases. There's cases where it won't. But, your management action, which we'll get to in the next step, is not going to be instantaneous. Hopefully you're realistic with your capabilities and you're setting yourself up to take action in the time that's reasonable. Occur before degradation, tied to standards. That's what we're talking about is And it's kind of a too late type situation. So I'm running low on time, but I'll run through the last couple steps here. Actions, management actions. These are, we're all aware of different permitting systems, allocation systems, user education. The court decision is asking us to be very specific about which of these things would be triggered when our standards are exceeded or when your thresholds are exceeded. So it's not enough to say, here's a threshold, then we'll see when we get there. These are the actual things that you're going to do when that takes place. An important note, identify actions reasonably foreseeable for life of the plan. It's hard to think out in 15, 20 years, much less, it's hard to think out in hours. So this is, you're trying to identify actions that you can take in 10 years. Monitoring. Of course, it's very important to know if you've exceeded your standards based on your indicators by monitoring the situation. You're going to ensure that, measures that you're taking are working prior to the degradation that's occurred. You're really tying all of your monitoring to those indicators and standards that you established away at the beginning of the process. So that is step 10. Hopefully that makes some sense, and I'm going to give it back to Randy to talk about how this ties into NEPA.
All right, thank you very much, Adam. I think you did a great job for coming in at the last minute to help with this. Got a few slides and then we'll be done. Yep, we'll be good. So we want to reinforce that the 10 steps are not a linear function of just walk through these steps, but they're more of a thought process and the types of things that you need to include and have involved as you go through your user capacity analysis. And part of any sort of analysis is going to lead to a decision, and in a federal context, that means you're going to have to invoke NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act compliance, and come up with some sort of NEPA documentation. Well, as we think about these 10 steps, they naturally dovetail in with the NEPA process in a number of ways. We don't want to think of this as a linear process, and NEPA is not really a linear process, though it has some discrete steps. But we think of it more as an iterative process of as you complete various portions of these steps, you're actually completing parts of the NEPA process, such as in step 1, where you're establishing those baselines, you're really coming up with your affected environment. Step 2, you're identifying your need for change. Steps 3 through 9 have all sorts of aspects that deal with the different alternatives that you're going to consider, the types of uses, what kind of uses, how many and where. They're going to play out in how you structure and define your alternatives as potentials for your area. Step 6 looks at those connected actions. Step 7 and 9 are really involved in the decisions, because that's where you're setting your thresholds, you're setting your final decision framework that you're going to use, and finally, in step 10, you're doing your monitoring. So the bottom line for all of this is that, with wild and scenic rivers, they're going to need to establish and identify a user capacity. That's pretty clear-cut from the judge or the circuit court judges. Even though it's a Ninth Circuit Court decision, other circuit courts are going to look at that and start to apply it nationwide. The CRMP should discuss the basis for those numbers, should have sound rationale, use the best available science, and we need to be proactive, use thresholds, use indicators that are responsive to the conditions that you have and the use types that you have, and then monitor those river values to ensure that we're meeting our protection and enhancement standard. And finally, identify a process where you can adjust those capacities over time if you see you're not meeting those standards. So the next steps for us as the Interagency Council is that, again, this paper that we've written, and we've just given you kind of a broad overview of the paper, is it's going through sort of a final review draft, and it's had one round of review. It's going through a second round of review after we send it out for comments. All of you will probably have a chance, if you're interested, to participate in a review comment as well. And then the technical paper, when it's finalized, will be placed on the rivers.gov website. And then we'll do some more training about that. I just want to mention that for any wild and scenic rivers need, you can find that on the rivers.gov website, as well as the river management website, where there's all sorts of information, useful information about wild and scenic rivers. So I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for sticking around today. And we'll stick around if you have any additional questions.
You are having your session tomorrow as well, so.
Yes, we have several sessions tomorrow to focus on specific aspects of managing a wild and scenic river based on the Act, and then on Section 7 of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, and specifically to the water resources projects.